Greetings, friends of liberty. I'm underway again in the TARDIS, as you can see, returning from Canterbury, England in the month of May 1215, where I was granted an audience with Archbishop Stephen Langton. In that audience, given the hostilities between many feudal barons and King John, I suggested the Archbishop write out a rough draft of the demands of the rebels for the king, which draft subsequently, of course, became the basis for the Magna Carta, one of the founding documents of English liberty. Truly a satisfying day's work, I must confess. And thus I'm quite pleased to again return to North America in the 21st century. In this video, we shall avail ourselves of researcher and political scientist John Lott, here co-author with Larry Kenney, who coincidentally has written a number of excellent books that broaden our understanding of free societies. Among these, More Guns, Less Crime, which conclusively demonstrates how the greater availability of firearms reduces the rate of societal violence, and the popular Freedomnomics, which shows the value of economic freedom in many different ways. In today's freely available paper entitled, How Dramatically Did Women's Suffrage Change the Size and Scope of Government?, the authors pose the following important question. Did letting American women exercise the right to vote, as happened gradually in all 50 states between 1869 for the territory of Wyoming and 1919 for the state of Wisconsin, mean that the country voted increasingly for Democrats and their liberal tax and spend policies? Good God, I hope not. Three fundamental questions thus present themselves. Number one, whether women getting the vote historically increased support for democratic policies. Number two, whether there is a gender gap between men and women in voting. And number three, the most difficult question of all, how much female voting must intrinsically, in all possible cases, change voting? Now, with regard to the first question, whether the vote increased actual support for Democrats in that historical period, it appears that the authors demonstrate this. They basically pull together all the different dates for women getting the vote in each of 50 states and align the expenditures in each state so that they all fall on year zero. So in other words, if Wyoming again started in 1869 and Wisconsin in 1919, they just shift the date to make their year zeros the same. So we can see how voting and the resulting expenditures changed. And as the results seem to show, on average, letting women during this time period vote resulted in a greater increase in expenditures in state government and programs, on average over 100% after 10 years. Now to the second question, whether there's a gender gap. If we look at Wikipedia and take their numbers at face value, we can see that the gender gap for women voting more democratically in presidential elections has recently been, from 1980 through 92, about 6%, and from 96 through 2020, almost 10%. Unfortunately, there apparently don't appear to be numbers available to show us the gender gaps before the 1950s, but their research would imply that there is, and was. Thirdly and finally is the most important question of all. What absolute percentages of men and women will vote for the Democrats and Republicans? So, for example, right now in the U.S., the present ratio among males is 28% Republican, 32% Democrat, and the rest independent. But for women, it's 25% Republican and 41% Democrat. The authors then seem to imply that these types of absolute numbers will always exist with female suffrage. They seem to be arguing that women genetically, because they're full of more caring, compassionate feelings, and also because more risk-averse, as statistics show, will likely vote more Democratic, and because women, being the primary caregivers, are less likely, all things being equal, to develop marketable skills, and thus would remain more dependent on and likely want more governmental welfare to a degree. John Lott specifically says in his book Freedomnomics, and I paraphrase, "Why has government gotten so large over the last 100 years? The most important reason seems to be female suffrage." So is this true in terms of absolute numbers? I doubt it. I think the primary cause is instead the huge growth in public education, both K-12 and higher, over the last 150 years. During that time, the percentage of children educated in public grammar schools, high schools, and colleges has increased enormously. I would guess offhand by over 70%. And of course, the government also controls many aspects of allegedly private schools and colleges as well. And if we accept the notion that governmentally influenced education, as we see very clearly today, is more likely to indoctrinate students with beliefs promoting big government and more government spending, then the great increase in the percentage of students educated in public education means potentially over the last 150 years, many more Democratic voters than otherwise would have been the case. And so what would the previously quoted percentages look like, in my estimation, if right now we had had no public education ever in the U.S., either K-12 or higher? I would say we would have doubled the percentage of Republican voters. So for males, instead of the present 28%, 55% Republican, or 56%, and for women, instead of the present 25%, 50%. In other words, with no public education, my understanding says that there would be a clear dominance of Republicans and independents over Democrats in the U.S. And by that I mean libertarian, classically liberal, small government Republicans. Now, John Lott actually expresses this very idea, the possibility that overall public education is a strong force for creating liberal voters. But not in this paper, but in his book Freedomnomics. There, on pages 188 to 192, he discusses how pervasively the U.S. government and others around the world use their schools to indoctrinate students, even calling this force stronger in the U.S. than the present media bias. And in another spot on page 6, Lott says, when talking about the attitude of dislike for free markets, I again paraphrasing, "If we examine the motivations facing professors, we see an obvious reason for this attitude, that substantial amounts of their financing, the financing for higher education, both public and private, is derived from the state." That having been said, are there any other objections to this last part of his theory? Well, we should note that since total government spending has increased from around 22% of GDP from 1945-50 to about 40% on average recently, and that during that time the percentage of female voters has roughly remained the same, a big increase in government spending occurred without female suffrage appreciably changing, as Lott also confirms. A final point is that, as the authors note, women were notable in their support for the illiberal 18th Amendment, the introduction of alcohol prohibition. But what they don't note, to my recollection, is that prohibition was repealed in 1933, which seems to imply that at least some women changed their minds. Women changing their minds? How very unusual. Wonder where that tune comes from. On that note, I bid you all well, and remain as ever the Scarlet Pimpernel.